The morning after my wife's funeral, I opened her personal safe. At the bottom, a sealed envelope. Do not open until they ask for money. My son-in-law called the next morning, then again. Then he named a number. That's when I broke the seal. What I found inside changed everything. They thought they were hiding it from a grieving old fool. They didn't know this grieving old fool spent 30 years hunting people exactly like them. Before continuing, subscribe to our new channel, where we tell stories about men who take revenge on their insolent children, sons-in-law, and daughters-in-law. My name is Ernest Coleman. I'm 68 years old, and I live in Charleston, South Carolina, in the same house on 4 Wentworth Lane that I've owned for 31 years. 3 stories, creaking oak floors, tall windows that face the street. I spent my career with the Criminal Investigation Division of the U.S. Department of the Treasury, tracking financial crimes, tax fraud, money laundering, the kind of work where you learn to read what people don't say louder than what they do. I retired 4 years ago. These days I restore antique marine chronometers in the basement workshop, broken ship's clocks from the 18th and 19th centuries, things most people would throw away. I find them, take them apart screw by screw, and make them run again. It requires patience. It requires silence. It requires the ability to look at something damaged and understand exactly where it went wrong. As hobbies go, it suits me. Our daughter Rebecca is 36. She has an MBA from the University of South Carolina and a talent for decorating rooms that belong to other people. She married Christopher Bennett, Chris, 6 years ago. He's 38, works as a financial consultant at Palmetto Wealth Advisors on Broad Street. Chris is the kind of man who always looks slightly better dressed than the occasion requires. At family dinners, he gave toasts that were somehow more about his own trajectory than the person being celebrated. Charming in the specific way that people are charming when charm is a professional tool. Practiced, calibrated, and always angled slightly towards something he wants. They moved in 3 years ago. Temporarily, Rebecca said, Chris had a real estate investment that needed 6 months to stabilize, and it made more sense to save on rent during that window. Sylvia agreed before I could calculate what temporarily might mean in practice. I love my daughter. I chose not to make it a battle. Here is what temporarily looked like by month 8. Rebecca had reorganized the kitchen in a way I still can't fully navigate. Chris had taken to collecting the mail from the front box before I came downstairs, setting aside what he deemed relevant and stacking the rest under a label he called household admin. He had opinions about which contractors to use for the roof repair, which financial advisors Sylvia should switch to, and whether my basement workshop constituted a liability from a homeowner's insurance standpoint. I noticed all of it. I said very little. Sylvia asked me once to give it time, so I gave it time. What I watched quietly over those 3 years was the steady narrowing of the space in which Sylvia and I operated. It happened the way a tide comes in. You don't see the water moving until you notice your feet are wet. Chris would mention casually that he'd spoken to Sylvia's financial advisor about optimizing the portfolio structure. Rebecca would ask, with great warmth, whether I'd thought about what would happen to the house down the road. There was always a document to look at, a decision that needed to happen now because the market was doing something complicated. And Sylvia, who had managed our household finances for 4 decades with the precision of a Swiss movement, grew quieter about money than I had ever known her to be. I noticed. I said nothing. The funeral was a full house. Sylvia had many friends, and Charleston turns out for its own. I stood in the receiving line for nearly 3 hours, shaking hands, thanking people I hadn't seen in years. The food that neighbors brought covered every surface of the dining room table. It was around 5 in the afternoon, with maybe 30 people still in the house, when Chris touched my elbow and steered me gently toward the hallway. Ernest, he said in the low, confidential register he uses when he wants you to feel like he's doing you a favor. I know this is terrible timing, and I wouldn't bring it up today if it weren't genuinely time-sensitive. There are a few documents that need your attention. Nothing complicated, just some joint asset management restructuring. Things that should have been handled sooner, honestly. Better for taxes, better for the estate. Sylvia and I had already discussed the general framework. He paused, letting that land. I could walk you through everything tomorrow, if that works. I looked at him. I've spent 3 decades watching people deliver partial truths, and the specific texture of it, the careful pacing, the appeal to urgency, the dropped reference to someone who can no longer contradict the story, is not something I forget just because I'm retired. Give me a couple of days, I said. He smiled. It was a good smile. Practiced, sympathetic, slightly patient, the way you smile at someone whose grief is an inconvenience you've graciously decided to accommodate. Of course. Take all the time you need. I went back to thanking guests. An hour later, I walked upstairs to take a moment alone. I don't know what made me stop in the bedroom doorway. Maybe the angle of the light, maybe 31 years of professional habit, but I stopped, and I looked at the wall beside the closet, and I felt the cold clarity that arrives when something is wrong before you can name it. The door to Sylvia's personal safe was open. Not fully, just a quarter inch, a dark gap where there should have been a flush surface. The electronic keypad showed a single red indicator light, a failed entry attempt. Someone had tried the combination and gotten it wrong. That safe had been closed, without exception, for every single day I could remember. I crossed the room without turning on the light and examined the safe door. No pry marks, no damage to the frame. Someone had tried the combination and failed. I entered it myself. April 14th, 1981. The day Sylvia and I were married, the lock disengaged. Inside, her good jewelry in a velvet roll, our life insurance policy, the property deed, a folder of medical records. I checked each item carefully. Nothing was missing, but at the very bottom, beneath the insurance documents, were 2 things I hadn't known were there. The first was a small purple folder. I recognized Sylvia's handwriting on the tab. Neat capital letters, the kind she used when something was meant to be found. Inside, a single handwritten page. Not a letter exactly. More like the note someone leaves when they know they won't be there to explain in person. If you're reading this, she wrote, then I'm gone, and they've already asked you for something. I didn't want to worry you while I was still here. I kept thinking I was misreading it. I kept thinking it would stop, but I watched it long enough to understand what it was. Check the registration of Magnolia Home Solutions, LLC. Look at the signatures on the documents Chris had me sign. Then compare those signatures to our 2019 will. That was all. No extra explanation, just a starting point, written by a woman who knew her husband well enough to know he'd find the rest himself. I set the page on the bed and reached back into the safe. The second item was a thick envelope of heavy yellow paper, sealed with dark wax. Written across the front in black marker, "Do not open until they ask for money." I turned it over. The seal was intact, unbroken. I put it back. She had left a specific condition. They hadn't met it yet. Chris had said documents. He'd said asset management restructuring. He hadn't said money, not in those words. Whatever was inside that envelope, I was not opening it before the condition was satisfied. Sylvia had been precise about everything else in her life. I wasn't about to override her now. I went down to the basement. The workshop hasn't changed in years. Pegboard on the walls, tools in their labeled places, the long bench under a line of adjustable lamps. In the center of the bench, partially disassembled, sat the 19th century ship's chronometer I'd been working on since autumn. The escapement mechanism needed complete reconstruction. Someone decades ago had attempted a repair with the wrong tools and left behind a subtle misalignment that had been quietly destroying the movement ever since. I could have replaced the damaged parts. I chose instead to understand exactly where the damage had started. I sat down on the stool and looked at it without touching anything. There's a kind of thinking I do best when my hands are still. I've done it in courtrooms and interrogation rooms, and on back porches waiting for search warrants to clear. The kind where you stop trying to construct a conclusion and let the facts arrange themselves. Sylvia had been watching something long enough to build a file. She had left instructions about a specific company. She had compared signatures. She had sealed an envelope with a condition attached to it, like a tripwire. I thought about Chris's hand on my elbow, the practiced timing, the way he'd said Sylvia and I had already discussed the general framework, designed to make me feel the decision was half made by someone I trusted, by someone who could no longer say otherwise. I thought about 3 years of Sylvia growing quieter about money. I thought about the word temporarily. I didn't touch the chronometer. I sat there until the house went quiet, and I let the facts arrange themselves. The next morning I was back at the bench by 7 when my phone rang. Chris. Ernie. Warm, measured, operating at what I'd come to think of as his professional frequency. The register he used when offering something while expecting something in return. I hope you got some rest. I know yesterday was incredibly hard. There are a few documents that really do need your attention soon. Rebecca's worried about the timeline. Would today work to sit down and go through everything? I watched the light coming through the small basement window, a harbor horn low and distant. Sure, Chris, I said. Today works fine. A pause, brief, but I caught it. He'd expected resistance. The absence of it recalibrated something in his thinking. Great, he said. I can have everything. Come by this afternoon, I said. I'll be here. I set the phone down and picked up my smallest screwdriver. The escapement wheel had 11 teeth, each one requiring individual examination before I could move to the next. I started with the first. By that point, I had already decided 3 things. First, I would read everything in that purple folder before the day was out. Second, I would find out exactly what Magnolia, Home Solutions LLC was, who registered it, and what it had touched. Third, I would not sign a single document until I understood with complete precision what I was being asked to give away. The yellow envelope would wait. Sylvia's condition hadn't been met. But looking at Chris's name on my phone screen, thinking about the careful architecture of that call, the sympathy arriving on schedule, the urgency tucked inside the concern, the Rebecca's worried deployed like a lever, I felt the first quiet, cold stirring of something I recognized from a long time ago. The feeling I used to get at the beginning of a case, when the shape of a scheme was just becoming visible through the noise. Before you had the evidence, before you had the proof, when you had only the pattern, and the pattern was already telling you that someone had made a very serious miscalculation. They assumed I was grieving. They assumed grief makes you slow. I went back to work on the escapement wheel. 11 teeth, one at a time. I suggested the coffee shop, not the house. There's a place on King Street called Heron and Cup. Dark wood, slow ceiling fans. The kind of place where tables are spaced far enough apart that a conversation stays private. I got there 12 minutes early and chose a seat facing the door. Old habit. I ordered black coffee and watched people come in off the street while I waited. Chris arrived exactly on time, which told me something. People who are confident they have leverage tend to be punctual. They want you to see them walk through the door. He was wearing a jacket despite the mild weather, a dark blazer over a light shirt, no tie, the carefully constructed version of casual that takes real effort to assemble. He spotted me, smiled the smile, and crossed the room with his hand already extended. Ernie, good to see you. How are you holding up? Sitting down helps, I said. He laughed as though that were charming and pulled out the chair across from me. From the leather bag on his shoulder, he produced a brown folder, set it on the table between us, and ordered an espresso from the server without looking at the menu, a man who knows what he wants and expects it to arrive promptly. I really appreciate you making the time, he said. I know the last few days have been incredibly difficult. You mentioned documents, I said. He nodded, opening the folder with practiced efficiency, the kind that suggested he'd done this before, presented paperwork to people in unfavorable emotional conditions, and guided them toward a signature. 3 items, all straightforward. He turned the first page toward me. The first document was a quitclaim deed, the instrument of choice when someone wants to move real estate quickly with minimal paperwork and minimal time for the signing party to grasp what they're surrendering. The property, 4 Wentworth Lane. Receiving party, Bennett Coleman Joint Management Trust, formatted to sound shared while placing sole control with trustee Christopher A. Bennett. I read every word. Chris watched me the way you watch a slow reader at a restaurant menu. The second document changed the primary beneficiary on a $320,000 life insurance policy from my name to the same trust. The third transferred management authority over an investment account holding $412,000 to that trust, with Chris as the sole authorized manager. I set the third page down and picked up my coffee. "What's the tax exposure you're worried about?" I asked. He was ready for that. He gave me a fluent 2-minute explanation about estate tax thresholds, stepped-up basis on inherited assets, and the administrative advantages of consolidated trust management. It was technically coherent. It was also structured to move very quickly past the part where I lost access to everything and arrive at the part where I was told this was good for me. "I'll need a week," I said, earnest. A slight shift in his voice, not impatient but firmer, the way a salesman moves from warm to purposeful when the closing window narrows. "The real estate market right now is genuinely unstable. The longer the property sits in any kind of administrative limbo, the more exposure there is. I really think we should—" I looked up from my coffee. "I said a week, Chris." He held my gaze for 2 seconds, recalibrated, and leaned back. "Of course," he said. "A week. Absolutely." We finished with the kind of small talk that exists purely to fill space after a negotiation stalls. He asked about my sleep. I told him it was fine. He mentioned that Rebecca was worried about me. I said that was kind of her. He paid the check. I let him, and we shook hands on the sidewalk outside. He walked back toward Broad Street. I stood there a moment and watched him go. I want to be precise about what I was thinking, because it matters. I wasn't angry. I wasn't even particularly surprised. What I felt was the clean, quiet activation of something that had been dormant for 4 years. The part of me that had spent 3 decades reading documents exactly like the ones Chris had just placed in front of me, from exactly the kind of person who had just placed them there. A quitclaim deed requires no warranty. It transfers whatever interest you have. It is the instrument of choice when someone wants to move property quickly and cleanly, with minimal paperwork and minimal time for the signing party to understand what they're giving up. I knew what a quitclaim deed was when I was 32. Chris apparently had decided I'd forgotten. I drove home and opened my laptop at the kitchen table. The South Carolina Secretary of State maintains a public business entity search. It takes about 40 seconds to use. I typed in Magnolia Home Solutions, LLC, and hit enter. Registered 3 years prior. Registered agent, Christopher A. Bennett. Director, Derek Bennett. Principal office, a Columbia Street address I didn't recognize. I printed the page, brought the purple folder down from the safe, and clipped the printout inside. Then I retrieved our 2019 will from the filing cabinet in the study. Signed with a notary, reviewed by our attorney, every clause examined before we touched the pen. I laid it open beside one of the documents from Chris's folder, the one carrying Sylvia's signature at the bottom. A signature is a habit. Sylvia had signed her name the same way for decades, the capital S turning sharply left before looping forward, the C in Coleman closing almost into a full circle. The signature on our 2019 will did both of those things. The one on Chris's document did neither. I held both pages toward the afternoon light and felt something settle in my chest the way a lock engages when the right key finds it. The next morning I drove to King Street. I'd found Conrad Hayes through the South Carolina Law Enforcement Division's Public Registry of Licensed Private Investigators. Not a referral, not a recommendation, just the list. His office was on the second floor of a narrow building above a framing shop, reached through a side door and a steep flight of stairs. The waiting area was one chair and a window overlooking the street below. He came out after about 3 minutes. Hayes was somewhere in his mid-50s, unhurried in the way that either signals deep competence or deep indifference. In his case, I suspected the former. He listened without interrupting while I explained what I needed. A complete financial profile on Magnolia, Home Solutions, LLC. Whatever banking activity was publicly traceable on Derek Bennett over the previous 3 years, and a search for any additional LLCs registered under either Christopher or Derek Bennett in South Carolina or Delaware. "Delaware," he said. "That would be my first guess, too," I said. He quoted me $3,800 for an initial retainer and a 2-week preliminary timeline. I wrote the check and left him the purple folder. From King Street, I drove to Meeting Street. Patricia Ward's office was on the 4th floor of a narrow building near the corner of Broad. Her assistant showed me in without much waiting. Ward herself was around 60, with reading glasses on a beaded chain and the precise, economical manner of someone who reviews documents for a living and has developed a low tolerance for imprecision in both paperwork and conversation. I explained what I needed: a forensic comparison between Sylvia's authenticated signature on our 2019 will and the signatures on two of Chris's documents, plus an independent legal analysis of the trust instrument, specifically the trustee authority provisions and revocation conditions. She reviewed both documents for 4 minutes without speaking. "The signatures," she said, "are not from the same person." "I know. I need that in writing." She quoted $1,200. I paid on the spot. "Written opinion within 10 days," she said. I walked out onto Meeting Street. 2 professionals were now working on my behalf. Neither had known me before this week. Neither owed me anything beyond the service I was paying them to provide. Exactly the arrangement I wanted. Clean transactions between strangers hold up better in documentation, and documentation was going to matter. I drove home. On Calhoun Street, I passed the First National Bank of Carolina without stopping. Nothing to do there yet, but I noted it. Back in the basement, I pulled the chronometer toward me. The escapement wheel was clean, each tooth measured. The next component was the balance spring, the coiled strip of metal that regulates the rhythm of the movement. A balance spring that has been slightly bent produces an error that compounds. A minute off per day becomes an hour off per month. Small distortions, left uncorrected, eventually make the whole instrument unreliable. I thought about the word temporarily. 3 years ago, I had watched the slow reorganization of spaces and decisions I'd previously considered mine. Mail collected before I came downstairs. Financial conversations I wasn't included in. Sylvia growing quieter about accounts I'd thought I understood. I had noticed all of it and done something I very rarely allowed myself in 31 years of professional work. I had assumed good faith. That assumption had cost Sylvia 2 years of carrying something alone. The phone rang at 7:15. Rebecca. Dad. The concerned register, the one that sounds like worry and functions like pressure. "I've been thinking about you. Are you eating? Sleeping okay?" "I'm managing fine," I said. "It's just... Chris mentioned the documents are still unsigned. He's not trying to push you. He just wants to make sure nothing gets complicated. Apparently, there are tax implications the longer we wait after a death in the family and..." "Tax implications," I said. "That's what he says. I don't know all the specifics, but Chris handles these situations, and he's genuinely concerned about the timeline." I picked up a small file from the workbench and turned it in my fingers. Outside the basement window, the last light was going out of the sky over the rooftops. "Rebecca," I said. "I understand." A pause. "So you'll sign?" "I said I understand the situation," I said. "That's all." Longer pause. I could hear her recalibrating. "Okay," she finally said. "I love you, Dad." "Good night, Rebecca." I set the phone on the bench and went back to the balance spring. It had 13 coils. I began counting them carefully, holding the movement up under the lamp. Somewhere on Broad Street, I was reasonably certain, Chris was receiving a report at that moment. The old man is stalling. He says he understands but won't commit. We may need another approach. I set the chronometer down on its rest and looked at the lamp above the bench for a moment. They thought I was grieving. They thought grief made a person soft and slow and manageable. In my experience, grief does exactly one thing with any reliability. It removes everything that isn't essential and leaves you with a very clear picture of what actually matters. I had a quitclaim deed I hadn't authorized. I had a signature that wasn't my wife's. I had a registered LLC I'd never heard of, run by my son-in-law's older brother. And somewhere at the bottom of a safe upstairs, I had a sealed yellow envelope I still hadn't opened. The clock on the wall read 8:43. 12 days until Patricia Ward's written opinion. 14 days until Conrad Hayes' first report. Plenty of time. I had always preferred to be patient. Let me go back to the morning, after the funeral. I need to do this properly because the sequence matters. When I opened the safe that first morning, before Hayes, before Ward, before the cafe on King Street, I found 2 things that Sylvia had left for me. The first was the purple folder with her handwritten instructions. Check the LLC, look at the signatures, compare with the 2019 will that I've already described. But the purple folder was not the last item in the safe. At the very bottom, beneath the velvet roll of jewelry and the insurance documents, lay something else, a heavy envelope of thick yellow paper, sealed with a circle of dark wax. Written across the front, in Sylvia's black marker, in capital letters deliberate enough that you couldn't misread a single one, "Do not open until they ask for money." I had stood there that first morning, holding it, and made a decision. She had given a specific condition. Chris had asked for a signature, but not for money. Restructuring, he'd said, documents, administrative matters, not money. I put the envelope back, closed the safe, went to the basement and thought. That was then. 2 weeks had now passed. Hayes and Ward were both working. I had sat across from Chris in a coffee shop and watched him present 3 instruments designed to strip me of this house, a $320,000 insurance policy and a $412,000 investment account, and said only, "I'll need a week." Rebecca had called that same evening and used the phrase tax implications as a lever. And then 2 evenings ago, she called again. "Dad, Chris has run the numbers. If the estate doesn't transfer management of the investment account within the next 10 days, the tax exposure could run to $60,000 or $70,000. We're talking about your money, Dad. Money you'd be losing. He's trying to protect you." There it was, in precise numerical terms, what it would cost me not to sign. That was close enough to asking for the money. I told Rebecca I'd think about it and ended the call. Then I went upstairs, opened the safe with the April 14th combination, and retrieved the yellow envelope for the second time. I carried it down to the basement, sat on the stool under the lamp, and held it in both hands for a while. I thought about the woman who had assembled whatever was inside, page by page, over nearly 2 years, while saying nothing to me. Then I broke the wax seal. The envelope contained 47 pages. I set them on the workbench and went through them one at a time. Pages 1 through 14. Bank statements from an account registered to Magnolia Home Solutions, LLC, at a Columbia address. Deposits ranging from $4,000 to $31,000, dated across a 2.5-year period. Several entries included reference numbers I recognized as originating from our joint investment account. Our money routed into a company I'd never heard of. Pages 15 through 22. Printed email exchanges. Most were between Chris and an address I didn't recognize, presumably Derek. The language was careful, nothing that would survive a sophistication test in isolation, but the pattern was legible to someone accustomed to reading financial correspondence for concealed intent. Move the second tranche before end of Q3. The trust documents are ready for her signature whenever she's ready. Her, Sylvia. Pages 23 through 31. Photocopies of signed documents. Most carried Sylvia's real signature, the leftward S, the closed C, but I stopped on page 23. Page 23 was a photocopy of a document titled Partial Interest Transfer, Residential Property. The address listed 4 Wentworth Lane. The instrument conveyed 18% of the ownership interest in the property to Magnolia Home Solutions, LLC. At the bottom, on the line marked Owner/Grantor, was a signature that looked exactly like mine. The date at the top